Well, we have been in this very famous chapter on resurrection. I don't know if all of you have been here the last few months, but we've been in this chapter, really the chapter in the Bible on resurrection after we die. And you'll remember that Paul began, if you can kind of remember back a month or so, he started by going backwards. And he said basically Jesus was resurrected. He appeared to Peter. He appeared to James. He appeared to the 500. And then Paul said he even appeared to me. Paul speaking of himself. And then he went forward. So he had started by going backward. Then he went forward and said, and that same Jesus one day very soon is going to make sure that we all are resurrected from the dead. That same Jesus is going to return to earth. He's going to make all things right, and he's going to hand the planet in all of its perfected glory back to the Father. And what's interesting then is that there's kind of this parenthetical moment that transpires in this chapter where the apostle who's been talking forward pauses and he begins to talk about the present. And I don't know that they had coffee breaks back in the first century. But if they did, it appears that he went on coffee break because Paul comes back from whatever interruption he was in, and all of a sudden, in like 4 verses, he is just fired up. He is upset. And I don't know if he met with somebody who angered him. I don't know if someone made fun of his balding head or his short stature. All I know is that he comes back to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and he is upset. He actually says, it is absurd that anyone would doubt the resurrection. He says, it is absurd that anyone would not believe in life after death. And then he just starts cranking with all these rhetorical and hyperbolic questions to say, you need to understand, O church at Corinth, what the resurrection means. And you need to understand what the resurrection, in fact, will do and should be doing in your life. And so we'll get back into the flow of his argument next week. But for today, if you have your Bibles, open them with me again to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And let's spend a little bit of time here in these 5 parenthetical verses. And I don't think actually, I know by the time you leave, you'll feel what Paul wants you to feel. You're going to get hit hard just like I got hit hard in the study this week. It is right between the eyes. It is a scalpel to the heart. It is a mirror on our life. And so I believe that you will thoroughly enjoy the Apostle Paul's passion. And so we're going to talk about how the resurrection impacts our Christian institution, which would just be referring to the church at large. We're going to talk about how the resurrection impacts our Christian suffering or sacrifice, and then we'll finish with talking about how the resurrection should be impacting our Christian ethics or our morality. And so go ahead and just read with me here, 1 Corinthians 15. Let's pick it up in verse 29 and just read a little bit to kind of get the heartbeat of this. He says, otherwise. So you can kind of feel it, He went away and came back here, and you recall he's been saying Jesus did rise. And there's evidence for that resurrection, and you're going to rise. And this resurrection thing is legitimate. So he's been going again and again and again to restating that truth, and then he comes back and says, otherwise. What will those do who are baptized for the dead? If the dead are not raised at all, well then, why then are they being baptized for them? Another rhetorical question in verse 30, why are we also in danger every hour? I protest, brethren, by the boasting in you, which I have in Christ Jesus our Lord. I'm dying daily. And if that's just purely human or from human motives, I fought with the wild beasts at Ephesus. What did it profit me? I mean, if the dead are not raised, let us go out, eat, drink, for tomorrow we die. And do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals. So become sober-minded as you ought and stop sinning. For some have no knowledge of God, and I speak this to your shame. And so hopefully you can sense this is not a flowery Cupids and Care Bear passage of the Bible, okay? This is hard-hitting stuff. And so if you're a note taker, let's begin the journey together. three simple slices of the pie, I think, is the best way to divide up this section. We'll put the first one on the screen now. He starts off by clarifying the impact the resurrection should have on what we call the Christian institution, or even the church. Just the organizational element, this thing, this beautiful thing, also the organism, we call it, called the church, because it's alive, it's comprised of people. So read with me there in verse 29. Otherwise, what will those do? Meaning otherwise, if Jesus hasn't come back from the dead and you're not coming back from the dead, there's no resurrection of the dead, what will those do who are baptized for the dead? If the dead are not raised at all, why then are they baptized for them? Now, real quickly there, make sure you circle the preposition huper, which is for in the English. What will those do who are baptized for the dead? That can be taken a bunch of different ways depending on context. It can be on behalf of, it can be for, it can be because of, it can be across, it can be over, it can be a dozen different things. All right, so that's important to understand. I remember I had a professor, Tom Schreiner, who once told us that in church history, get this, there are nearly 300 different interpretations or views of this particular verse. So I thought this morning we would take our time and go through all 300 of them. So hope you're ready to, no, I'm just kidding. Now obviously we can't do that, but let's try to wrap our mind around it a little bit. All right, let's make sure we start off with what it's not saying. Okay? Now I would highly doubt that we have any Mormons in the room today, but let's be clear. It's not saying what the Mormons have said that it's saying, which is what seems to be the most plain reading in the English, which is that you can go up to your temple and you can be baptized on behalf of your ancestors who've already died. So they die, they're not saved, end quote. You can then go to the Mormon temple, for example, in Salt Lake, and you can be baptized in proxy or vicariously on behalf of your dead relatives, okay? That's not what it means. In fact, there was an old story in the 70s, true story, of a Mormon lady who went up to the temple in Salt Lake and got baptized thousands of times for her relatives. In fact, she'd go up there repeatedly, pay the money, and she would get baptized. And so she eventually ran out of relatives. Thousands of baptisms, she ran out of relatives. She traced her whole family tree. So then she decided to get baptized for a bunch of famous people. So she got baptized for Cleopatra. She got baptized for Julius Caesar. She got baptized, true story, for Napoleon Bonaparte. And on and on and on it went. By the time she was done, she was in old age, she actually said she believed that she had died or she had resurrected or saved as many people, get this, as Jesus had. Now that's about as heretical as you can possibly be, all right? So let's be clear right from the front. That's not what Paul is talking about here. Out of the 300, let me give you three of the most likely views, okay? Here they are. Number one, it could possibly be what we call the superstition view. The superstition view, and you can put that right there in the margin. Now, all that would mean is that there were a group in Corinth, not the church Paul's writing to, the true Christian church, but there was a group of pagans who had a pagan ritual or liturgy where they were in fact doing this particular rite of baptism for their dead ancestors. That is possible. That would be like us illustrating with the Mormons today. And Paul is simply writing, and he's saying, in effect, hey, listen, if even the pagans are over there in a corner being baptized for their dead ancestors, and they believe in a resurrection, he uses that as an illustrative device to say, well, how much more so should you Christians believe the same thing? That's possible, although probably not the most likely. So here's another one, not the superstition view, but number two, the situation view. And the situation view would simply mean that there's a small church in Corinth, probably 100 to 200 people, and basically they would have really felt the vacancies when somebody died. And you can imagine that, right? If you showed up at church and it's a 100-person church and then you have a great singer or have a great teacher or you have someone who's been a valiant usher for a long time and suddenly they're gone, well then the idea would be Paul is saying, hey listen, somebody else needs to step up now. Somebody else needs to walk forward and be baptized and step into their position because there's a lot of vacancies left in the church. And so step up and then get baptized on behalf of those who've come before you. And that was a very popular and prominent view in the early church, although I think obviously there are weaknesses there as well, which leads us to the third one, and probably the one that is most likely, which we call the inspiration view. So instead of the situational view, and instead of the superstition view, this would be the inspiration view, which simply was that Paul is saying, take that preposition huper, for, and actually it just means because. So if you were to read it again, it would be otherwise, what will those do who were baptized because of the dead? And all he's saying is that you, church at Corinth, came to faith and you were baptized because there were martyrs in the faith in your city who came before you, and you watched the way they died for Christ, and it motivated you to follow. And therefore he's saying, what use is this whole thing called the church and martyrdom if there's no resurrection after the dead? Even their death and your subsequent baptism was a waste. And I think that possibly that third view, the inspiration view, is what Paul means. And here's the reason why. Because in context, that's the point that he is in fact making. All right? That's the point that he's making. Now, regardless of which one of the three that you choose, don't miss the forest for the trees. The point that he's making is that if there's no resurrection, all of it is a dumb liturgy. If there's no resurrection from the dead, and Jesus wasn't raised, and you're not going to be raised with him after you die, well, then everything you do in the church, the baptisms that you do in the church, the communions that you do in the church, the singing that you do in the church, the teaching that you do in the church, signing up for ministries in the church, coming in and sitting in your gray chairs in the church, everything, the evangelism and the missionary work and everything you do in the church, Paul says, all of it is simply a waste, a massive waste of your time. That's the point that he's making. The institution called the church is a waste of your time if there's no resurrection after death, which I think all of us would go, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. And by the way, friends, that slides right over into our service Sunday, our ministry fair, right outside those tables. Whereas, if you do not believe in there's a resurrection, the last thing you want to do today is go out and sign up for ministry. If you don't believe there's a resurrection, the last thing you should do ever is go to membership class. If you don't believe there's a resurrection, the last thing you should ever do is submit to a bunch of elders. If you don't believe there's a resurrection, the last thing you should ever do is give your life to love all these other people around you, because that would be an absolute waste of your time. That's the point that Paul's making. In fact, you might as well just try to take everything you can from this group of people sitting around you and pity them for their time at church and believing that some first century carpenter started something called the church that is going to actually save their soul. Because the whole thing, if there's no resurrection, is a waste. And then he moves on, look at this. And he moves on from the resurrection and how it impacts the very institution of the church, and our mobilization as a church, and our drive as a church, and our focuses as a church, our foci. And then he moves on, number 2, to the resurrection, you ready? And Christian suffering or sacrifice. Look at verse 30. Now, this is where things get rather intense. A bunch of rhetorical questions. He says, why are we also in danger every hour? And by the way, we don't need to get technical here, but that's accusative in the original language. It's an accusative of time. So he's literally saying always. Why are we also in danger always? Meaning in the first century church, whether it was Paul, the other apostles, or even the church at Corinth, they were always in jeopardy. He says, why are we doing this if there's no resurrection? I protest. I love that. I'm going to argue with you, brethren, by the boasting in you. Meaning I'm going to actually talk about you guys as my boast. The fact that you in Corinth are suffering for the gospel. He says, why am I suffering for the gospel? Why are you suffering for the gospel, which I have in Christ Jesus our Lord? And then he comes back and he says, I even for this die daily. And hopefully you can see how he's moving from the method to the motive. The whole point here is constant suffering. We're always in danger. We're daily laying ourselves down. We're daily in jeopardy. were daily abused. And then look at verse 32. He stretches the hyperbole. And if it's only human, if it was only from a human motive, if there's no heaven and there's no resurrection and there's no coming salvation, there's no eternal life, he says, then I fought with the wild beasts at Ephesus, and what did it profit me? Now, sidebar there, friends. We don't believe that Paul ever fought the wild beast in Ephesus, right? Because, number one, he never talks about it in his little auto sketches of 2 Corinthians 11. Also, Luke never chronicles it, but here's the key. He was a Roman citizen, and Roman citizens were never thrown to the lions or thrown to the beast. And so what he's doing here is he's painting the picture, hyperbolically, of the ultimate nobility of martyrdom, saying, even if I walked down into the arena, and even if I stood there on the sand, and even if I watched as the lions and the tigers and the bears came at me, and I stood and I gave a testimony in front of all the audiences of Ephesus or Rome, but there's no resurrection, I was a fool. And then in verse 32, he explains the heart of it all. Because if the dead are not raised, read it with me, you've heard this before, right? If the dead are not raised, then what? Let us eat, drink. Some of you would say, be merry. Let us eat, drink, for tomorrow we die. Then he goes on right there, and that's what that is. It's a quote from Meander, one of the Epicureans, and what he's doing is he's grabbing this ancient Greek comedy, and he's using the quote saying, hey, if there's no resurrection, join the pagans and party it up, because tomorrow you're gone. Fascinating, there was a Greek historian named Herodotus who used to tell about the Egyptians, and I think some of you will really appreciate this. He used to tell how the Egyptians, at their big fancy elite parties, would actually have a coffin paraded through the big house with a fake dead corpse on the inside. And I want you to try to picture that. So you go to a big party, I don't know where you go, down to Newport Coast, someone's really fancy house, and then you have this big coffin, and you got a fake dead guy on the inside, and then along the side of the coffin it would say, party hard tonight, whatever the Egyptian version of that was, because tomorrow you're going to be like this guy. And the whole idea was to stir and to incite debauchery and revelry to the nth degree by reminding people that when this day's done, it might be over, so you got to go hard and you got to crave and you got to grab all that you can. And that's the point he's making. That's how the pagan, the non-resurrectionist lives. Saying, I've got to get what I've got to get today because tomorrow I'm going to be dust. Now, don't miss Paul's case logic here, okay? If you got a pen, would you just write 2 little notes there in your margin real quick? He's restating how, you ready? A non-resurrectionist, which would be anybody who believes you're just going into the dirt, a non-resurrectionist lives their life. That's what he's doing there in verse 32. He's living for today. It's fleshly cravings for today. It's fleshly fortune for today. It's my fleshly rights. It's my fleshly rewards. And by the way, friends, in our modern university system, that's what we call nihilism, right? And that's what is our university system today. That's the entire next generation that's coming up behind ours, right? Telling young people, you need to find your little tribe and do whatever you desire, and no one can question that. And if they do, it's called hate speech. And so they refuse to work, they march in the streets, they tear down City Hall, they contract their STDs, they self-soothe with all their antidepressants, and many of them now are committing suicide because they were told at a young age, just live it up. It's the Disney lie. Chase your heart. You go after what you want to go after, and don't let anyone push back on you. In fact, if Law and Order or a church or a parent says no to you, man, that's hate speech because it's your truth and you need to chase it. What Paul is doing is speaking right to our modern culture. He says that's how the non-resurrectionist lives. And then you could write this down there next to verse 32 as well. The opposite, the Christian, the resurrectionist, lives the other way. The opposite of that. Instead of demanding his rights and demanding his flesh and demanding his cravings and demanding his fortunes and demanding his rewards, he's giving them up. He's giving up his rights. She's giving up her creature comforts, their dreams, their goals, even their physical life. All the trinkets of earth are laid down for the treasures of heaven. In fact, listen real closely to this. Everyone remember Hebrews chapter 11, verse 35? Remember the author says, some were tortured, not accepting their release, in order that they might obtain, listen to this, a better resurrection. The whole heart of this hall of faith in Hebrews 11 is pointing towards this future resurrection. Then he goes on and he says, they experienced mocking and scourging, yes, also chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were put to death with the sword. They went about in sheepskins and in goatskins, being destitute and afflicted, ill-treated, men of whom the world was not worthy, wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. And all of these, he says, having gained approval through their faith, did not receive what was promised here, because God had provided something better where? There. That's the point of Hebrews 11. He says these men and women in the hall of faith, they weren't focused on the here and now. They were focused and aiming for the then and for the there. Now, I don't know how Paul would illustrate this if he were here, but I want to give you kind of an idea. Here's what I think he would say to us if he were here today. He would say, guys, please. Remember, he's a short guy with a bald head, right? And he had a little pointy nose, they say. And he was about 5'5", and he walked with a limp, so he would have walked up here, and he would have looked at you, and he would have said, please, please, please listen to me. And then he would have pointed, I think he could have pointed and said, hey, picture right now the timeline of eternity. So can you all do that with me real quick? Can you picture the timeline going? So here's now, okay? 12 inches, here's me. This is my 5 seconds on the ball of dirt, this little foot. Now I want you to picture with me, if you would, all the way out to the freeway, and then all the way out to the beach. And the timeline continues to go on and on and on and on. So try to picture that with me if you could. That's eternity, okay? Here's what Paul's trying to say. Earthlings, worldlings, non-resurrectionists, all they do is live for this 12 inches where I'm standing right here. That's everything. What can I do? What can I get? What can I feel? What can I love? What can I enjoy right here? He says, but the Christian does what? The true resurrectionist who knows there's more to come turns and realizes that what happens in this little 1 foot impacts the coming miles. Does that kind of make sense? All the worldlings are living right here. And by the way, even as Christians, we're often tempted to live where? Right here. Where a true Christian who understands all that's coming turns and says, what I'm doing here is going to impact what's happening there, and I need to make sure I live my present with my end in mind. Does that make sense? That's the difference. I actually saw, someone sent me this week, this little video of some loony preacher in Texas. And he's like yelling at his little church. And he was saying, hey, listen, we got to win, we got to win, we got to win. And then he actually started making fun of all the people, the Christians that are still living in like liberal states, which by the way, hello, that's us, right? I don't know if you knew that or not, but we're a little liberal, we're a little progressive, right? So he's picking on California and Washington, he's picking on New Zealand, he's picking on Canada, he was going off on everybody, and then he actually said these words. I was fascinated. I'm like, hey, what are you talking about? He said, hey, they're not going to win, they're not going to win. They all got to come here where we're going to win. And then he said, they're all stupid. He called you stupid. Paul stupid? Were the heroes of faith in Hebrews 11 stupid? Was Stephen the martyr stupid? What about Jesus, who said you will have trouble on this earth? Oh, and by the way, blessed are you when you're insulted, and blessed are you when you're persecuted. And then he actually says, and be glad. Why? Because your reward is great where? in heaven. Was Jim Elliot stupid when he laid there and the Yankee Indians took arrows to his back and he gave what he could not keep to gain what he would never lose? Was that stupid or was that Christian? And I would submit to you that Paul's saying that's what it means to be a Christian. To lay down your life, your rights, and even your freedoms for God and for other people. That is what it means to be Christian, not stupid. You're not stupid for being in this room. You're not stupid for praying with your discipleship groups and stepping forward to do evangelism at the doors out here. You're not stupid for going down to the beach at Balboa Pier and witnessing to the lost. You're not stupid for holding the line for things that matter. You are a Christian for doing that. And by the way, that'll slide right over as well into Ministry Fair Sunday. I mean, if you're not a resurrectionist, don't serve. And if you're not a resurrectionist, don't give another dime. And if you're not a resurrectionist, then you need to get out of here and find a place where you can live for yourself, because it's your money, your home, your time, your cars, your family, and your freedom. You just go for it if you're not a resurrectionist. But man, if you believe that there's a reward coming, then you lay your life down. Paul says, listen, the resurrection has an impact on the church. The resurrection has an impact on how you suffer. But also, number 3, look at this one. And he's super clear on this one in verse 33. The resurrection is going to impact just the way you live your daily life. So number 3, the resurrection in Christian ethics. He goes right after our morality. Look at it in verse 33. And all this is application. He moves from method to motive to morals. And he says, don't be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals. We've all heard that. Become sober-minded as you ought and stop sinning. For some have no knowledge of God. And then he even says, I'm speaking this to your shame. Ouch. Now, go ahead if you have a pen and just really quickly in the time that we have left, just write down the 3 applications that he gives here. They're so clear you can't miss them, okay? Here they are. Right there, I'm going to give them all to you right up front in verse 33 and 34. He says, number 1, if you're really a Christian who really believes in the resurrection, who really believes you're going to stand before the Lord, who really believes that you're going to give an account for the deeds done in the body, both good and bad, he says, number 1, you need to leave the wrong friends. Number 2, you need to wake to the raw realities of what's going on in life. And number 3, you need to start making the right choices when it comes to personal sin issues. So I'm going to go through each of those real quick, and they'll be on the screen. Here we go. Number 1, he says you need to leave the wrong friends. You see that? Bad company corrupts good morals. In the modern world, we would just say, show me your friends, I'll show you your future. And by the way, everybody should know that by now. If you want to know who you are, just look at your friends. If you're not sure who you are, look at who you hang out with. That tells you who you are. Right? In Proverbs chapter 1, it's fascinating how Solomon says to his son, hear my son, your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching, for they are a graceful wreath to your head and ornaments about your neck. Now listen to this. Then he goes off and he says, my son, he actually adds plural pronouns. If sinners, fascinating, he says it's plural, they entice you, do not consent. Why? Because sin always travels in packs and in cruising in gangs. That's why if you go back to junior high and high school, you'll remember it was the cool crowd or some crowd that sucked you into doing things that you swore you would never do. They always come in a group. And he actually goes on and he says, if they say, come with us, let us lie and wait for blood, let us ambush the innocent without cause, let us swallow them alive like Sheol. We shall find all kinds of precious wealth, and we shall fill our houses with spoil. What he's saying to his son, you picture Solomon looking at little Rehoboam saying, hey, if you're going to walk the straight and narrow, there's not going to be a lot of room for others on the straight and narrow, but there's a whole bunch of room over here on the broad, wide road. But you better watch out, because those big groups are going to walk over and they're going to try to take you, and they're going to try to change you, and before you know it, you're going to be something that you never intended to be. First thing that Paul says is you better walk away from the wrong friends. If you're hanging with the wrong people, it's going to lead to disaster. Number 2, here's another one. He says you need to wake to the raw reality. You see it there? Look at verse 34. Become sober-minded. That means sober up. That means shake it off. You remember in the old Western movies, you ever seen those, when they would take the drunk guy and then they would put his head in the water trough and go, and then they'd pull it up. You ever seen that? And then he's sitting there looking around and then they put it in there again, and then they pull him up. That's what he's picturing here. He says, wake up. The enemy, the prince of the power of the air, has you under a sociological stupor, and he uses all his different mechanisms from education and politics and media and entertainment, and he's pouring his filth down upon you, and that's why this whole next generation that's coming up is literally lost in their existentialism. And by the way, every parent in the room and grandparent in the room knows the next generation seems to be lost because the enemy is holding them bound. And he says, you got to wake up. You got to wake up. That's why we do VBSs, by the way. See, if you're coming to VBS, ladies, all right, so let me see. Ladies, okay, I got minivans. How many minivans do we hear? We all have minivans at this church, I've noticed, and they're all white. So if you have a white minivan, here's the key. VBS was never originally designed for church kids. Did you know that? Vacation Bible School originally was designed for the neighborhood kids who did not know Jesus. So here's what you got to do. If you're coming to VBS this year and you have a minivan and you're bringing your 2.4, you have room in there, because I've seen those things, for another 3.6. So you go around your neighborhood, you get those little cards, and you tell your neighbors, hey, listen, you agree with me that there's something going on in our world and that our kids are being targeted. And the only hope that I believe they have is the good news of Jesus Christ. Our church is putting this thing on for a whole week, and I want your kids to come with me. And they're looking at you thinking, I don't know about that, but I'm getting free childcare. I'm in. And grandmothers, load it up. Rent a van and get them here. Pack this place out, right? Because the only hope, 2 Corinthians 10:5, is that we are destroying the speculations and all the ideologies that are raised up against the knowledge of God, and we're taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. If the church isn't going to do it, then who will? And by the way, you want to hear what's really cool? At the end of VBS week, they're going to have a big presentation where all the VBS kids are going to sing. If the kids have to come on Sunday and sing, guess who has to come on Sunday to listen? You say, that's pragmatism. Yes, it is. We're going to put them in the room and we're going to give them the truth of the gospel. And every year there are parents who are saved because their kids came to VBS. Some of you, by the way, in this very room are here because that's how you got here. Number 3, leave the wrong friends. Wake to the raw realities. And then number 3 is pretty obvious, right? Make the right choices. You see it there? Stop sinning. And hopefully you understand exactly what he's saying. If you believe in the resurrection, that you're going to be with God, and you believe that you're a child of God, then quite naturally you're going to start living in a way that pleases God. Did you understand that? Was that very simple? That's very simple? Okay. Actually, let's just make this really simple. Let's do show of hands, because I know our church does show. By the way, last week, Shepherd's House, they were very confused by all my questions looking for show of hands. They thought I was going charismatic on them. But by the end, they got there. Okay, let me ask, show of hands, who in here believes, show of hands, that there is a resurrection and that one day you are going to be with God? Okay, very good. So let me lead it number 2, okay? Who believes that that was the work and the act of God in your life? Show of hands? Okay. Then number 3, naturally, if we believe we're going to be with God and that we're children of God, would we not want to live our life in a way that what? That pleases God. Is that not true? That's what Paul's saying. I mean, Ezekiel and I last Friday were watching America's Funniest Home Videos or whatever, which we love. It's just like clean. It's great. You get to laugh at people who've allowed you to laugh at them. They sent the videos, right? You ever seen that? It's like, okay, it's not gossip, not slander. So our favorite ones are always, and I know you've seen these, where the people don't know there's cameras on them. That's why they're funny. You know, the guy that's like dancing with a cat and there's a Ring doorbell and, so Zeke and I were laughing and we're watching, and I just want you to think about this. Isn't it interesting that there's a whole group of people out there who still don't understand that virtually everything we do is recorded. I know some of you are in here and you're like, really? Yeah, everything you do is going to be on a camera somewhere, right? Now, I just want to transfer that over really quick to the spiritual realm. See, pagans and non-resurrectionists live their entire life believing that everything they're doing is happening in a vacuum, it's happening in a bubble, it's happening in a dark room, and no one's ever going to see it. The Christian resurrectionist understands this truth, that everything is seen by God. And that every deed done in the body, both good and bad, will be judged. Your penalties are taken care of by Christ, but your future opportunities in the kingdom and the rewards will be displayed for all to see. And literally, the video of your life will be shown.